In the autumn of 1784, a small prince was born in Madrid, taking the very first steps toward a destiny few could have foreseen. His name was Ferdinand. One day he would ascend the Spanish throne and rule his country, but the legacy he left behind would be anything but ordinary. For Ferdinand would be remembered not only for his political choices, but also for his dark desires, obsessions, and unsettling personality. Even today, historians still debate a haunting question. Was he a victim of circumstance or a monster in his own right? Ferdinand's childhood unfolded within the walls of a grand palace, yet behind the gilded facade there was no peace, only intrigue. His father, King Charles IV, was a weak and passive man who preferred hunting and leisure over the burdens of ruling. He left matters of state in the hands of his advisers and stronger personalities around him. His mother, Queen Maria Louisa, was the exact opposite, dominant, ambitious, and commanding. But her reputation was tarnished not just as a queen, but as the central figure in a scandal. Whispers echoed through every corridor. The queen was engaged in a secret affair with the powerful prime minister, Manuel Godoy. These rumors grew so loud that even young Ferdinand could not escape them. As a child, he sensed the closeness between his mother and Godoy and watched his father's weakness with disdain. Some went further still, claiming, Ferdinand is not the king's son at all. He is Godoy's child. Whether true or not, the suspicion would shape Ferdinand's life. From a very early age, he began doubting his own identity and trusting no one around him. The most striking feature of his childhood was his solitude. While other princes played, Ferdinand often withdrew into corners of the palace, lost in hours of silent thought. His gaze was cold, and he struggled to form connections with others. Those who knew him described a withdrawn, distant, and somewhat shadowy boy. This isolation planted deep insecurities within him. He learned that in the palace, betrayal was always close at hand, and by the time he was 10, he had already discovered that survival meant becoming part of the intrigues himself. In the eyes of the people, Ferdinand was never a charming child. His stern expression, cold demeanor, and distant posture left others uneasy. Yet behind this mask lay something far more dangerous: resentment. Hatred for his father, weakness, and fury at his mother, disgrace, grew within him like a smoldering fire. Meanwhile, Europe was undergoing seismic change. The French Revolution had shaken monarchies to their core, and the very foundations of royal power trembled. A young general named Napoleon Bonaparte was rising like a storm across the continent. Spain, caught in the middle, was rotting from within, struggling to survive. Ferdinand watched silently, but his silence masked a crystal-clear conviction. His father could not rule, and his mother had shamed the crown. Only he could save Spain. The idea taking root in young Ferdinand's mind foreshadowed the choices he would make later in life. Long before he ever wore the crown, he was already plotting the games that would shape his kingdom. Beneath his cold expression lay an ambition as deep as it was dangerous. Raised in the shadows of palace intrigue, this child would one day reshape Spain, not toward salvation, but toward ruin. Years passed and Ferdinand grew older. The quiet, withdrawn boy of his childhood began to reveal a very different side in his youth. He no longer wanted to wait. He was impatient to taste power. But one great obstacle stood in his way: his own family. His father, Charles IV, still sat on the throne, though he was weaker than ever. Instead of ruling, he wasted his days with hunting trips and idle pleasures. To Ferdinand, this weakness rendered his father worthless. In his eyes, all of Spain's problems stemmed from his father's lack of willpower, and from his mother's entanglement with Manuel Godoy. Everyone at court knew the truth. The real ruler of Spain was not Charles IV, but Queen Maria Louisa and her rumored lover, Godoy. Among the people, Godoy was despised. A man of humble peasant origins, He had risen to power through the Queen's favor and was eventually even granted the title Prince of Spain. His position humiliated the nobility, infuriated the people, and filled Ferdinand with a burning hatred. By now he did not only want to depose his father, he wanted revenge against his mother and Godoy as well. The young prince's greatest ambition was to seize the throne as soon as possible. To achieve this, he gathered around him a loyal circle of supporters, mostly nobles who despised Charles and Godoy. They held secret meetings, speaking of Ferdinand as the true king. Slowly, among the people too, the idea began to spread. Ferdinand is our savior. After all, they were weary of Charles's weakness and Godoy's corruption. Ferdinand's schemes grew bolder. He was no longer content to plot against his family. He was prepared to make moves against the world itself. With the fiery recklessness of youth, he made a grave mistake. He sent secret letters to Napoleon of France. In them, he confessed his hatred of his father, expressed his desire to claim the throne, and begged for Napoleon's support. In other words, he betrayed not only his family, but his own country, appealing to a foreign ruler for help. For Ferdinand, this was nothing more than a tactical move. To him, any act, no matter how treacherous, was justified if it brought him closer to power. The letters were soon exposed, and scandal erupted in the palace. Ferdinand was arrested. Charles IV was outraged at his son's betrayal, but at the same time, helpless. He did not dare punish him severely, for much of the Spanish population already supported Ferdinand. A harsh sentence against his son might have triggered rebellion. Ferdinand knew this, and so his contempt for his father, his hatred for his mother, and his loathing of Godoy only grew deeper. During this period, Ferdinand's behavior revealed the darkest aspects of his character. He was cold-blooded, calculating, and always self-serving. He trusted no one, yet he skillfully manipulated others. He could discard allies in an instant and regarded betrayal as nothing more than a useful tool. Meanwhile, Spain was collapsing into chaos. The people suffered from hunger, poverty, and the looming threat of war. The royal family's bitter internal conflict only weakened the nation further, and Ferdinand sought to exploit this turmoil for his own advantage. For him, the throne was the only goal, not for the people, not for Spain, but for his own ambition, and that ambition would drag Spain down a path of ruin from which there would be no return. Europe's destiny was shifting. In France, Napoleon Bonaparte had risen to power, and with his armies, he brought nearly the entire continent to its knees. No kingdom could withstand him for long. Spain was no exception. Already rotting from within, weakened by corruption and palace intrigues, the Spanish monarchy faced Napoleon as a deadly threat. It was in this moment that Ferdinand once again stepped onto the stage. He no longer sought vengeance only against his father and Godoy. His eyes were now fixed on the entire throne of Spain. Seeing Napoleon's might, Ferdinand believed that an alliance with him could secure his ambitions. And so he committed the greatest sin a prince could. He placed his hopes in his country's enemy. Secretly, he sent word to Napoleon promising that if France supported him, he would claim the crown. Meanwhile, the Spanish people were suffering terribly. Hunger, poverty, and unemployment spread across the land. Many were furious at Godoy, who had made disastrous treaties with France and failed to stand firm against Napoleon. For this reason, public anger shifted in Ferdinand's favor. More and more, he was seen as the savior prince. But the people did not know the truth. Ferdinand himself was courting Napoleon Bonaparte support behind the scenes. By 1808, Spain reached its breaking point. The Aranjuez uprising erupted, fueled by rage against Godoy. The mob stormed the royal palace, nearly tearing him apart. Under immense pressure, Charles IV abdicated in favor of his son. At last, Ferdinand had achieved what he had long desired, the throne. Crowds filled the streets chanting his name, crying, "Long live King Ferdinand!" But his triumph was short-lived. The true victor was neither Ferdinand nor his father, it was Napoleon. France had already moved troops into Spain, pretending to be an ally, but in reality, Napoleon had planned to seize the throne for his own family. While Ferdinand believed himself a king, he was little more than a pawn. Napoleon invited Ferdinand to Bayonne. Blinded by inexperience and ambition, Ferdinand accepted. He traveled to France with his closest advisers, only to face the greatest humiliation of his life. Napoleon sat Ferdinand, Charles IV, and Godoy at the same table. With harsh words and relentless pressure, he forced both father and son to abdicate. The crown of Spain was handed to Napoleon's brother, Joseph Bonaparte. The savior king the people had hailed was suddenly exposed as a helpless puppet. Napoleon confined Ferdinand to exile in Valence, while Spaniards at home reacted with both shock and anger. The man they had trusted to save them had proven unable to even hold onto his own throne. And yet, strangely, exile did not destroy Ferdinand. Instead, it fueled his ambition. For years he remained in Valence, but all the while he plotted his return. To Ferdinand, defeat was never final. It was only a pause. One day, he swore, he would reclaim his throne, and this time he would bow to no one. The years of exile in Valence were both a period of humiliation for Ferdinand and the birthplace of his future ambitions. While he languished in France, Napoleon's wars were tearing Spain apart. The country had risen against the French occupation, and what became known as the War of Independence had begun. Spanish guerrilla fighters waged a relentless war of attrition, striking fear into the French army. Amid this chaos, one name lingered constantly on the people's lips: Ferdinand VII. Ironically, it wasn't his deeds that made him a hero, but his very absence. The Spanish longed to believe that their exiled prince would be the fearless leader who could liberate them from Napoleon-esque grip. It was during this period that he earned the title El Deseado, the Desired One. In their imagination, Ferdinand became a savior, a symbol of hope, though in reality he was powerless in his French confinement. By 1813, Napoleon's power was crumbling. The combined force of the British Army, Spanish guerrillas, and other European coalitions pushed the French back. The Treaty of Valence was signed, granting Ferdinand his freedom. At last, the long-awaited return of the desired king was at hand. As Ferdinand traveled toward Madrid, Spain erupted in celebration. The streets turned into a festival. Crowds showered him with flowers, prayers, and songs. Women waved handkerchiefs from their balconies. Men shouted in the squares, "Long live King Ferdinand." For a fleeting moment it seemed as though the entire nation was united behind him, but the joy would not last. Almost immediately upon setting foot in Madrid, Ferdinand revealed his true nature. The throne he regained was not the fruit of his own heroism, but of his people's sacrifice in resisting French rule. Yet Ferdinand showed no gratitude. During the war, Spain's Cortes, the National Assembly, had drafted a new constitution, a visionary document known as the Constitution of 1812. It guaranteed press freedom, representation for the people, and strict limits on absolute monarchy. It was one of the most progressive charters in Europe at the time. Ferdinand's first act as king was to destroy it. He dissolved the Cortes, abolished the Constitution, and reinstated the absolute monarchy. In a single stroke of the pen, the dreams of modernization, liberty, and reform were crushed. From that moment on, Ferdinand ceased to be the savior king. To many, he became the king of betrayal. He had personally shattered the hopes of a nation that had carried him back to power. Liberal thinkers and reformers were driven into exile or thrown into prisons. Thousands faced persecution and torture. Spain, which had glimpsed the promise of a brighter future, was instead dragged back into darkness. The bitter irony was that Ferdinand had used the love of his people to return, only to turn that very love into the foundation of a regime of repression. Those who had once lifted him on their shoulders into Madrid would, within a few short years, find themselves fleeing his tyranny. When Ferdinand returned to Spain, he was seen as a living legend. But very soon, that legend turned into a nightmare. The same people who had once welcomed him as their savior were now fleeing from his tyranny. For once on the throne, Ferdinand crushed the hopes of freedom and ruled the nation with an iron fist. After 1814, silence fell over Spain, but it was not the silence of peace, it was the silence of fear. Ferdinand branded anyone with liberal ideas as an enemy. He destroyed freedom of the press, silenced the universities, and threw intellectuals into prison. Exiles, torture, and executions became a grim part of everyday life. The people who once cried out for the desired king now cursed him as Ferdinand the Tyrant. Yet his scandals were not confined to politics. Ferdinand's personal life was equally infamous. Across Europe, shocking stories circulated about his obsessions and excesses. His uncontrollable lust, his obsession with women, and his shameless indulgence turned him into not only a cruel ruler, but also a deeply corrupt one. The royal palace ceased to be a center of government and became instead the stage for Ferdinand's pleasures and debauchery. His behavior alarmed not only nobles, but even the Catholic Church itself. Normally, the Church stood firmly behind monarchs, but Ferdinand's moral collapse was so obvious that even priests and bishops began to abandon him in silence, refusing to pray for their king. Meanwhile, Europe was changing. The Industrial Revolution was reshaping societies, and liberal ideas were spreading rapidly. But Spain, under Ferdinand's rule, seemed trapped in the Middle Ages. Science stagnated, the economy faltered, and one by one Spain's colonies in Latin America declared independence. Ferdinand was not only crushing his own people, but also dragging Spain backwards on the world stage. And yet, despite everything, Ferdinand managed to keep his throne. The people of Spain were not yet strong or organized enough to overthrow absolute monarchy. The harsher Ferdinand ruled, the more fear gripped the nation, leaving it voiceless. His tyranny endured for years. The greatest irony of all was this: the Spanish people had once longed for Ferdinand as a liberator from Napoleon. But in the end, their own king proved to be far more ruthless than the emperor they had fought so hard to resist. The final years of Ferdinand's reign were as scandalous as its beginning. As time passed, the king's political and personal life grew even more chaotic. He was no longer remembered solely as a tyrant, but as a man whose depravity left a dark stain on European history. His obsession with women remained uncontrollable even in old age. He married multiple times, yet each union ended in tragedy or whispers of scandal. His first 3 wives died, whether from illness or misfortune, but rumors spread among the people. Many believed these deaths were not mere accidents, but the result of sinister intrigues within the royal court. Among his marriages, the most consequential was with his last wife, the young and ambitious Maria Cristina. This union would open the door to a new chapter in Spanish history, for Ferdinand had no male heir. In his final years, the question of succession ignited a political storm. By tradition, the throne was to pass only to a male heir. But Ferdinand defied convention, naming his daughter Isabella as successor. This decision plunged Spain into a bloody conflict that would rage for decades, the Carlist Wars. Yet even more infamous than his politics was the decay of his private life. Tales from within the palace spoke of unrestrained indulgence. His relentless pursuit of young women, even servants, led to accusations that he had completely abandoned any sense of morality. For this reason, some European historians would later brand him with the notorious title, the most perverted king in history. When Ferdinand died in 1833, Spain was torn between relief and dread. Some saw his death as liberation, while others knew it marked the beginning of chaos and civil war. His legacy was not simply political turmoil, it was also the profound disappointment of a nation betrayed by the very man it once hailed as its savior. Today, historians describe Ferdinand VII as a ruler who strangled freedom, dragged his country backward, and placed his personal desires above the destiny of Spain. He had begun as a liberator in the eyes of his people, but he was remembered by history as a tyrant consumed by scandal. And that is why so many historians agree on one haunting judgment. Ferdinand VII was truly one of the most perverted kings in history. When Ferdinand VII died, he left behind not only a throne, but also a nation in ruins. His reign became a symbol of devastation and backwardness for Spain. Once welcomed by the people with cries of "The Savior has returned," he was remembered at his death as nothing more than a tyrant, a king consumed by corruption and perversion. After his death, Spain plunged into seemingly endless chaos. By naming his daughter as heir, Ferdinand set in motion the Carlist Wars, bloody conflicts that turned the nation into a battlefield for years. While the rest of Europe moved forward, embracing progress and modern reforms, Spain remained trapped in turmoil, unable to find stability. The consequences of Ferdinand's decisions scarred not just his own era, but generations to come. Among Europe's monarchs and historians, his name is often spoken with disdain. Ferdinand was neither a political genius nor a visionary leader. Instead, he was a ruler enslaved by his own desires, dragging his country backward in pursuit of personal indulgence. And yet, his story still holds a lingering mystery. Were the deaths of his wives mere coincidence or the result of darker intrigues? Were his infamous vices exaggerated gossip or evidence of hidden scandals carefully buried by the royal courts of Europe? These questions continue to spark debate among historians to this day. In the end, one image of Ferdinand VII remains fixed in memory. A king who promised freedom but brought oppression. A ruler once hailed as a savior who became a tyrant. A man consumed by his own passions who destroyed both his legacy and his nation. And perhaps this is why his story endures, not merely as the tale of a king, but as a tragic reminder of how power, ambition, and corruption can utterly consume the human soul.